Good afternoon and welcome. This is your Mountain State Update for May 14th, 2017. Your Sunday political sermon right here on WTSQ LP.
Hey, you got Jailhouse Rock in that machine somewhere?
Yeah, I think we do. I think we can play that for you.
Yeah.
Today I'm joined by the station manager and a familiar voice in the mornings, Laura Allen.
Howdy. How's it going?
Laura.
And the man and the myth himself, Dan Heyman.
Yeah.
Now, that is still your name, right? You didn't get like a prison name?
No,
I don't have to call you Spider or like Dan the Scorpion.
I think I'll adopt that, Dan the Scorpion.
I like Spider, personally.
Man, I look bad in orange.
So,
I really do.
You know, everyone does. It's okay. So we're gonna talk about the Dan Heyman's situation that unfolded earlier this week, Trump firing Comey, and we're going to talk about the West Virginia Supreme Court ruling that anti-gay assault is not, in OT, not considered a hate crime in West Virginia.
That's pretty outrageous.
Yeah, and if we have time, we'll go into some this interesting list that the Boston Globe put up of 20 Democrats that might run for president in 2020, because it's never too soon in America to start talking about that. So, okay, let's get started with this. Now, first I want to get Lauren's take.
Well, here's. I mean, the first thing I want to say, sort of as in putting my station manager hat on for just a moment, is to remind everyone that whatever we express in this program, that's right, they don't necessarily reflect the views of the station, the views of our leadership, underwriters, or volunteers at WTSQ, and also we have to acknowledge that Dan, of course, is a volunteer host here with us, and that's just really important to give folks context as we start to talk about the events of the past week.
I'm worth every penny you pay me.
Now, really, this should be understood going forward, all the past shows, all the future shows. Our opinions and any opinions that guests that come on here and express are their own opinions.
Right.
And they begin and end at that person.
Right.
WTSQ, does not necessarily agree or disagree with anything anyone says on this show. This is
we have no
talk.
Official stance, right?
Right,
yeah.
and that's that should be known to most people, but I really want to underline it.
I mean, we provide WTSQ, and when I say we in this context, I mean WTSQ provides a space for us to have debate, because debate is interesting.
And it serves the community.
And it serves the
necessary.
community. It doesn't necessarily mean that what happens in that space is owned by the station or the board or anybody except for me and my big fat mouth.
All right. So now that's out of the way. All right. So
Thank
Dan,
you, John.
Let's go ahead and let you. I'm just going to sit back here and put my hands behind my head and lean back and just kind of let you tell the story here, and we'll ask you questions a little bit along the way, maybe.
Sure.
But I want you to just kind of to give us the complete rundown of what happened with you.
Right.
Earlier this week. Was it Tuesday?
It was Tuesday.
Yeah, okay.
Basically, Monday, I found out that got an email from a local organization that said that they were going to be protesting because Tom Price, the Federal Department of Health Secretary, Health and Human Services, was going to be in town. He's going to be at a thing at the Capitol, and they were going to show up to protest about pre-existing conditions. And I had not heard that he was going to be here. I mean, maybe I got something from the governor's office and missed the email, or maybe I'm not on the right distribution list. Apparently he did later in the day have some press availability, but I didn't know about that. I just thought, oh, here's this guy's coming to town. And the reason it was interesting to me is because I was already working on a story about the impact of the change in pre-existing condition rules. Because before the Affordable Care Act, there were women who had, battered women, women who were victims of domestic violence, who lost their insurance because they were victims of domestic violence, or because the outgrowth of domestic violence, either physical or psychological, was considered a pre-existing condition, which I consider to be fairly outrageous. Some of the states got into this a little bit. Some of them outlawed that practice by the insurance companies. some did not. But it was sort of overruled by the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. And so I wanted to find out what the impact on the changes in pre-existing condition rules might be on these cases.
Sounds like, a reasonable question.
It's a fairly technical, fairly important public policy issue.
If they're going to be pushing this type of rollback, they're going to have lots of little questions like this because that's what it means.
So I was working on this, and I just decided in sort of pushy reportorial fashion that he was going to be walking through the state capitol, which is a public space,
right,
on the way to this meeting. So I just decided I'd stick my microphone out, or in this case, my cell phone out, to see if I could catch a comment from him on this. That's basically what happened. He walked. I positioned myself by the door to the entrance. And as he came in, and I was wearing a press pass, but it had been raining, so I was also wearing a jacket. So I'm not entirely sure whether anybody saw my
That was one of my
press
questions.
pass.
Did you have press credentials?
I had my press
you did.
pass on. I also had my shirt on that said Public News Service because that's who I was doing this for. But I don't think that was visible because of the jacket. But we'll get into more of that in a minute. But basically, I stuck my phone out and I asked him the questions, and I tried to walk along with him, and he didn't answer. And the first, just to cut to the chase, the first officer of any kind, law enforcement officer of any kind, who identified him as such and said anything about, you're doing something wrong, was the guy who arrested me. There was no warning. There was no, get away from him, kid. Nobody tried to pull me back and hold me in place to wait till they passed by. That was pretty. There's a lot to say about that, but that's basically what happened, and I identified myself as a reporter. Not that legally that makes any difference, because a member of the public should be able to ask questions in a peaceable way,
right,
in a public place. Now, the criminal
still worth
complaint,
pointing out that you were doing your job, though.
It's still worth pointing out that I was doing my job. I had a reason for doing it. I wasn't doing it as a protester. I wasn't doing it to cause trouble. I wasn't trying to get into anybody's space. That's what the criminal complaint said, is that I tried to, quote, breach the Secret Service.
Right, that's what I read, yeah.
Which...
it also said that, sorry to interrupt, but
that's fine.
It said that you were removed a couple of times, quote, a couple of times. Did someone remove you a couple of times?
No.
Well, then why is that in there?
That's
the thing that caught me the most, was he was removed a couple of times?
Yeah. There's a couple of things that happened. Basically, about all that happened was that guys stood in my way.
Okay.
They never identified themselves as
Secret Service,
which
of course they might
staff.
not.
They probably don't have to.
Well,
do that.
being Secret Service,
right, exactly.
they would not.
Right.
But they could have been staffers, and I suspect some of them were. I mean, I don't really know, who was what. Nobody was wearing a sign.
But you weren't removed a couple of times. That's just false.
No, they just stood in my way, and I reached past them to hold my phone out. Mm-hmm. And I kind of jostled with them a little bit.
Which is what, anybody who knows anything about reporting, this is how it goes.
Being in a crowded subway.
Well, sure, but this is how reporting goes. I mean,
sure.
When you do perp walks or stuff like that, anybody who's worked or knows anyone that's worked at any news station or anything, you ask questions repeatedly, you follow people. I mean, that's how it goes. This is the way it works.
Anybody who's been in the profession for more than about a week has done this.
Right, in some context. And it could be as simple as a city hall meeting,
a perp walk, meeting.
And you generally you annoy the person you're talking to also. I mean, that's the way it works.
You're walking down the hall
friend.
trying to get a comment from the mayor about what just happened in the city council meeting. This happens constantly. In fact, if you Google, Tom Price talking to reporters, You can find on
all kinds of examples,
pictures of this. Do a Google image search, and there's pictures of him talking to reporters walking down the hallway in Washington.
Everyone has done it.
And in fact, they did an interview with him later on, and Hugh Hewitt, who's a conservative talk show host, asked him, well, did you think this guy was menacing? And Tom Price said, no, not really. And Hewitt and everybody else who's basically reacted to this said, what's the big deal? I mean, this is, this happens all the time.
Now, sorry to interrupt again, but
that's fine.
I wanted to jump in there. I saw your interview on CNN, and I think it was would have been Wednesday morning or
something like that.
Yeah. And it was a nice interview.
I lose track.
It was a good interview, by the way.
Chris Cuomo.
Although I was I wanted to point out to them that Dan's last name is Heyman, not Heyman.
Right.
I repeatedly called you by the wrong name.
People want to say Heyman. People don't want to say Hyman. I mean, they want to say Heyman.
Yeah, whatever.
Let me put it this way. I used to work at West Virginia Public Broadcasting. Laura and I both used to. And there were West Virginia Public Broadcasting reporters who were mispronouncing my name.
Interesting.
So I'm used to it.
That being said, here's what I got out of the interview. I really one was that you weren't aware that Kellyanne Conway was there, and I think that's the other important context of this story. And again, to sort of throw that slightly devil's advocate question in there, I think you did a really nice job, sort of saying, I probably, if I'd known she was there and I'd known that was going on, I might have been in her space a little bit. That's what I heard in your interview.
I didn't realize.
Yeah.
But
were you close to her?
At one
Without
point,
knowing it.
At one point, you can hear in the tape, I didn't realize I was trying to change position to get a better angle on Price. And somebody says to me, don't get too close to her, or something, to words to that effect. Get back from her or something. And I turned around and realized there was Kellyanne Conway. And I backed up.
Maybe that's what they were referring to with the removed thing.
Well,
even though that's still not really.
No, I mean, we were all still in the same hallway.
When I read removed, to me, it read to me like you were escorted out of the building a couple times.
The
like,
cops
that's what it read
were
like.
Obviously in the complaint trying to make it as grandiose sounding as possible. Because that's what cops do.
Well, the other thing I really respected about the way you handled yourself on CNN and handled the story, and I thought it really spoke to your ability as a journalist to be objective in a way. I mean, you're there to ask questions, but you also, and I think that's what a reasonable journalist is going to do in that situation. They're going to, of course, go after the story, but journalists, and this is again the trope that's been out there for a couple of years now, that journalists are bad, that journalists are rude, that journalists, and the reality is, that they're doing a job because the public has a right to know the truth about things. And sometimes that's annoying. Sometimes the truth is annoying. And I think that you're to be commended for that. I think the other thing that's important to recognize in all of this is that whatever happened, gosh, and I just lost my train of thought. Please, someone rescue me. It'll come back.
I find the truth very annoying. I agree with your point.
I mean, it can be.
The surveys, the public surveys that I think Laura may be referring to, and maybe this is your point, is that, the public does not personally like the press.
Right.
Or at least they don't like aggressive, reporting.
And that's fine.
They regard us as being kind of jerks, which I can be on occasion. I've been accused of being a jerk and probably am. But they also trust us. They don't like us, but they trust us.
Well, journalism, if you're really doing journalism, you're telling a story that somebody doesn't want you to tell.
Well, that's George Orwell's quote. He said,
everything else is public relations.
Everything else is public relations.
Exactly. And I think there's my point. Thank you, guys.
That's
exactly what's happened, I think, because of... Well, you can trace this all the way back to the Fairness Doctrine and Ronald Reagan and the rise of far-right talk news, which is very commercial and so what's happened over time is that news has been treated like public relations in a lot of ways.
Oh, yeah.
And so, journalists who are out there really trying to stick to journalism are portrayed in a rather villainous light. But without journalists being hardcore, we wouldn't have had the Watergate scandal covered the way it was. We wouldn't have,
that's been
important.
That's been the public reaction. That's also interestingly been the reaction in the right-wing press. Is that they don't, the Breitbart did 2 or 3 pieces on us. Hugh Hewitt did an interview with Tom Price, talked about this. There's been a bunch of Well, actually, I've been sort of astonished by the level of coverage, but that's another story. But everybody basically has come to my defense, or pretty much everybody has come to my defense and said, "Look, he's just doing his job," which
I was very pleased to see. I was kind of pleasantly surprised by that because you know how the internet is. Everybody has to be devil's advocate to everyone else's devil's advocate, and everyone has to be contrarian, and everything ends up muddied up and ruined by the end of the day. But this was pretty much like 85-90% of everything I saw was like, this is crazy. That guy was doing his job. What are you all doing?
Well, I think that I to back up a second from the situation and try to analyze why it happened and why people reacted that way, is that I think one thing that's going on in the background here is that there is a lot of antipathy and mistrust of the press on the part of the Trump administration, which I don't mean to focus on, say my arrest is a result of Donald Trump. I don't think it was. I think that there's a kind of an adversarial stance, especially regarding this healthcare stuff. When people, either Republicans in Congress or someone like Tom Price from the administration, is out in the public and they're afraid of catching flack from protesters or angry, constituents or whatever. So they have this defensive crouch that they're in. Mm-hmm. And I think that translated a little bit to the way that security was handled at the Capitol, because there's a line, there's a fine gray area between having personal security and being protected from uncomfortable questions. Those two things get, overlapped a little bit.
There's gray area.
There is a gray area there. And so maybe between the combination of that and the Capitol Police, I think maybe they either assumed I was a protester really, or they assumed that, they were being maybe overly secure because Kellyanne Conway was there and the Secret Service, and they don't get the Secret Service there every day.
Sure. Sorry, go ahead. What was your point?
Well, one more thing is that it's interesting that if it had just been Tom Price, the Secret Service wouldn't have been there. He probably has his own security, but
but he's Health and Human Resources, right?
Right, but cabinet secretaries don't get Secret Service protection, which I didn't realize.
I didn't realize that either.
Yeah, but anyway, so between that, so there's this defensive crouch that kind of translated to the local cops.
Right.
On the other hand, the public and professional reporters have been growing increasingly concerned about this lack of access and the diminution of the role of a free press and the erosion.
He tweeted about canceling
press briefings this week.
Yeah, and just handing out written talking points.
He doesn't want to.
I don't know about that one. That's a little.
And that's a big deal. And I think people feel it's a big deal. And into this steps Dan, and he puts his big old, size 12 feet in his mouth, and he's asking this kind of technical question, and it just blows up.
Right.
Yeah.
Now let me ask you this, because a lot of people, I've seen this covered in lots of different ways. I've been paying attention to this all week very closely. And one thing, I'm basically a Dan Heyman historian right now. And but anyway, so there are a lot of people
astonished.
There are people looking at this and saying, okay, this is indicative of what's going on at the federal level.
Right.
And there is this, like you're saying, there's this distrust with the Trump administration and the media. There's this gap growing and growing. Now, it was state police that carried out the arrest.
Capitol Police.
Okay, Capitol Police. Even still, local, regional
officials. Well, I think they were interacting with the Secret Service. But
so your theory is that the Secret Service put them up to it.
Well, or had some influence at least.
Yeah. I would. And here's the other thing I appreciated about your conversation on CNN, and I've read the Esquire piece, and maybe not quite as intensely as John here, but I have definitely followed this all week long. I think the other thing you said that I really appreciated as a citizen was that the police, did their job and they did it okay. They weren't nasty to you.
No, they didn't beat me up. They
were professional. Right. They didn't, and I appreciate that.
They were aggressive, but I mean,
But they're police making an arrest.
They're police.
That's right.
They were aggressive. I was aggressive.
Right.
Everybody's
Once they're in
aggressive.
arrest mode, it's
one thing I want to make clear is that if there is an issue of broader First Amendment importance, we're really talking about drift. Okay, we're talking about the tendency of federal officials to try to withdraw from the press. We're talking about the tendency of their security to maybe do their job overly aggressively. Okay, we're not talking about there was some kind of conscious decision where Donald Trump called the West Virginia State Capitol Police and said, if this guy Heyman shows up, you arrest him. I don't think anything like that happened. Right. There wasn't a set policy, keep the press away from me, keep, get this guy out of here. I don't think there was any conscious decision making.
Do you think it's fair that a gradual shift in culture and the way the attitude that has changed that ultimately emanates from Trump and people in his orbit? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's probably. I mean, it certainly
may have indirectly led to this.
He isn't alone in that, but I think but he's part of
president.
And I also think there's a history of that in this country that goes back to 1980 and the demise of the Fairness Doctrine. Sure. I think you've seen that drift. I would argue that.
That's been going on for 30
Trump
years,
is just the latest symptom, and perhaps maybe one could argue the culmination of that drift. Perhaps, I think even that. I think it's really important to see this all in context, and I think that's the other reason why. Let me say this also: the Fourth Estate is doing really great work right now. Like I think all the stuff that's been happening in the country. I think in a way, a year ago, we could argue that the press and journalism dropped the ball and did some things that contributed to the outcome of the election. Conversely, I would say they are now really responding with like, oh man, we really have to remember who and what we are. And I also think the important context to remember in the election, this goes on to our next topic, the dismissal of Jim Comey this week. But I think, the whole idea that this isn't caused by one thing alone, right? This drift isn't caused by one thing. The election of Donald Trump wasn't caused by one thing. There's a lot of, it's complex, and we've got to look at it in a complex way. And
that's right. Yeah. And I think two more comments. One is that drift can oftentimes be more dangerous than a set policy.
Yes.
Because if there's a set policy, then you see it and you know about it and you can treat it as an isolated thing. Sure. But if it's just a gradual cultural shift, then it's kind of hard to see.
It's hard to pin down.
Hard to stop. The other thing I want to say, and then
you're slowly turning the dial, the dial on the frog in the water.
Right. Yeah. The other thing I want to say is that I really have a lot more sympathy for people who get interviewed a lot now.
Oh yeah.
You get. I mean, the day after this happened, my frickin' phone was ringing off the wall. I was getting calls. You do 3 or 4 of those in a day. Real solid interviews in a day, and you're wiped, man.
Right. Yeah.
That's hard work. So I'm going to have a lot more respect for like politicians and movie stars and stuff now.
The West Virginia ACLU has been really outspoken on this. And they said they've called this arrest, quote, a blatant attempt to chill an independent free press. Now, we've talked a little bit about what we think of it, but what do you think of that characterization?
Well, I think it's an attempt to chill an independent press, but maybe as a side effect. I wouldn't necessarily call it a blatant attempt. I don't think like I said, I don't think there was a conscious attempt to slap down reporting. But I do think that there's, like I said, there's this gray area between security and, access. And I think that they have been leaning towards security. And we've been seeing this at the state capitol too. I mean, this isn't unique to the federal level. I mean, we've seen since the terrorist attacks of 9/11, there's been an increasing level of security. They were talking a few years ago about putting up these big concrete barriers so people couldn't drive onto the Capitol grounds. They put in metal detectors. There's a lot more tightness now about public people showing up in large numbers at the Capitol. The Capitol used to be really open. Used to be able to show up with a crowd.
I remember
of people.
when the doors weren't just locked. All the doors
you could
are
just
locked.
walk in.
Right, I do remember. That wasn't that long ago.
That wasn't that long ago,
years.
and now that, and in part of that,
I think 9/11 did a little bit of that to us
also
culturally.
guns. The availability of guns is part of that, but the, that drift is part of this broader context, and I'm sure that the police, in typical security fashion, they are focused on their jobs, which is providing security, and maybe that means that they end up over providing security.
Sure. Did you see that the West Virginia Department of Military Affairs and Public Safety released a comment on this?
I was
tried to do a
really
little
kind
bit
of peeved at Larry Messina for saying that. I know Larry.
Now, they said that there was quote, no effort to silence Dan Heyman.
Yeah,
except having him arrested and removed. You weren't silenced. You were just arrested and removed from the area.
And Larry said that it was my physical something that not the questions I was asking. No, I mean it was. If they had asked me to back up, I would have. And Tom Price said, this gentleman was not in a press conference.
Like the First Amendment is limited to press conferences.
Yeah, and if there had been a press conference, I would have gladly shown up. I would have asked my one question and then sat down.
Tom Price said that, right?
Yeah.
Like, what does that mean? Like, does he not understand that you can be asked questions
he
outside
knows.
of press conferences?
He knows.
Why would he say that?
He was looking for an excuse.
I think it all
Price,
gets into this drift and this context of where, we've seen it in press conferences at the White House. You're rude, be quiet. You're rude, be quiet. I think that's and we could talk about that sort of the slow drift. I think one of the other reasons, Dan, there was a reaction to your story the way there was what happened with Jim Comey. I do think that there's like this raising of the bar. The director of the FBI gets dismissed, and this reporter in West Virginia gets kind of pulled out of the situation. I do think that people are connecting events.
The reaction to the Comey firing has been a real, it really confirmed what a lot of people's worst fears are.
Sure. And we'll get to that. We're going to go right into that, but I just wanted to clear up one last thing. I looked through some local West Virginia news stations' comment sections and stuff. And
oh, really? You read the comments?
And I saw some alarming theories. So I just want to clear this up before we move on.
Right.
Are you now, or have you ever been, a secret communist Obama spy?
No.
Okay. Let me write that down. I'll mark that off. Mark that off the list. All right. Have you ever been a Marxist, fascist, predator, alien, Terminator, or anything like that we need to know about?
No.
Okay. Well, somebody out there named Bob thinks you are. So
really, an alien or a Marxist or
I made that predator alien part up. But the secret communist Obama spy thing I saw a couple times.
Really?
Yeah. No joke.
I have never met the president, former president.
Okay. Yeah. So.
I've never met anyone in his personal circle.
Just wanted to clear that up. Okay, so now
never worked for them.
So we'll move on here. So that's half the show gone.
Right.
But that's good. I'm glad we got to talk about that.
Yes.
And we may it'll probably be relevant later, and we may be talking about it later. But there's your overall synopsis of what happened.
Right.
And so hopefully now this is going to be pursued. They haven't dropped the charges yet, correct?
Well, they haven't dropped the charges. We don't know what's going to happen.
Okay.
We're still waiting for a signal of when the hearing would be.
Alrighty. Well, so that's all we have on that at the moment. So we may bring that up and revisit it when more happens if you're okay with it. But
sure.
For now, let's go ahead and move on. Trump fired Comey. So let's go ahead and talk about this. On the surface, to me, this seems like kind of puts people who are hard partisan in a weird spot, because Democrats who hated Comey during the election are now at his defense, and Republicans who loved him during the election are now hating him.
Yeah.
So, people who are hardcore partisan, you can spot them right now. This is one of those issues where you can spot the people that are intellectually dishonest, about and partisan, because they were just praising him,
right,
or they were just hating him, and they've flipped. Now, there's more nuance to it if you look deep into it.
There's a lot more nuance.
Now, but you can spot the people who were, who have flip flopped, unashamedly.
I expected. I wasn't calling for it, but before the election, I was expecting if Hillary won, that Comey would resign. I wasn't saying that should happen. I would have
Sure.
probably greeted that with
I think that would have made
acceptance.
sense.
It would have made sense.
Yeah, that would have not surprised me one bit. In fact, I remember thinking the same thing. If she wins, my goodness, his days are
gone.
numbered. Yeah,
yeah. But
Definitely.
I don't. I wasn't. I don't think I've ever called for him to be fired.
No, really, a lot of people on the left, the hypocrisy that people are pointing out with people on the left, I don't think I agree that there's a lot of hypocrisy on the left for this because Democrats a lot of liberals really never started liking Comey.
Right.
It's just once Trump got in there and surrounded himself with the characters that he's surrounded himself with, Comey comparatively seems a lot better.
Well, and I think Jim Comey is a flawed human being, as we all are. And so I think it's really important to provide that context as well. I think that, he made a really bad decision.
Yeah.
And as we look back on it, as these investigations into the Trump-Russia ties continue, like what was exactly going on? I mean, there's no telling how far and how deep that might go. We just don't know yet. And I think when we find out those answers, this is going to make those answers are going to place this in a better context than what we have. Right
The timing is what gets me, right?
No, absolutely.
Because if he wanted to have a fresh start with the FBI and all that, he would have done this as soon as he got in, or he would wait until after this investigation because he knows how this is going to make the situation look, right? I mean, Trump knows how this is going to make it look. He knew ahead of time that this was going to make him look like Nixon, right? He must have known that. But he did it anyway.
The thing that strikes me about the timing is that I've been reading a few things online where there are intimations, and I don't know how accurate this are because this is second, third hand information, but reporting from trusted outlets. Like I think the New York Times has been doing some stuff like this, and I know this has showed up at Talking Points Memo, is that there are folks who are saying that Trump himself and his immediate circle apparently thought that this Comey firing, because of the Democratic objections to him, that the Comey firing was going to be greeted with joy. And what that says to me is, what were they thinking?
That's like, if that's really true, then that's just as concerning for a different reason. He's so tone deaf. Yeah. He's so unaware and so tone deaf that he thought that was going to be greeted with open arms by everybody.
Yeah, I know. I mean, that's the thing that strikes me is like,
that's almost more striking.
What was he thinking? You know,
that's weird. If that's true, what do you think? What's your take on it?
A lot of people have said never underestimate the intelligence or capacity for incompetence of the Trump presidency.
Sure.
I really don't know.
That's
pretty astonishing.
That's like comical.
Yeah. Well, it would be if it wasn't so serious.
Right. Now, there's not a lot to compare this to.
No.
There's people trying to draw comparisons with when Bill Clinton fired the director of the FBI. I don't really buy that because he wasn't investigating Bill Clinton at the time. I think that was Jeff Sessions, wasn't it? I don't know. Who was that?
I'd have to double check.
Maybe he wasn't the director of the FBI, but he fired somebody.
It could have been. It was Bill Sessions.
It was Sessions, yeah.
But
so that's what people are comparing it to. I don't really buy that because there was no investigation going on, at least none that we knew of.
Well, there may have, at some point, of course, there was a special prosecutor who was investigating Clinton.
On the perjury thing.
Yeah, the Paula Jones, the Ken Starr investigation. But that's the point behind the special prosecutor, the special whatever it is. Special prosecutor is that they're separate from the Justice Department.
Exactly.
Right.
They're separate
That's
from
why
the
they're special.
FBI. Yeah, exactly. That makes them special.
And then there's the Nixon comparison.
Right.
Which I feel like is still not quite the same, but it's maybe a little more apt.
Stephen Colbert, cited this tweet from the Nixon library. And he said, fun fact, Richard Nixon never fired the FBI director. And Stephen Colbert said, yes, and this is the only fun fact from contained in the Nixon library. It really is amazing. I mean, the Saturday Night Massacre, which is when Nixon fired the then special prosecutor and basically cleaned out much of the Justice Department in order to do so, and as part of that, it's it's not exactly analogous because the investigation of Nixon was much further along, and it was a much riper, more clearly adversarial process. We really kind of, at that point, I vaguely remember this from my childhood, which is dating me.
Right.
Yeah, right. Is that we knew more about what we were in the middle of.
Yes, I think that's, I do think this dismissal is a fairly shocking event, but it is interesting.
Precipitous,
it is
sudden.
Yeah, it's sudden, and I think the other thing that's troubling is that during Watergate, it was Republicans who went to the White House,
right? Mm-hmm. Yes,
and said, "Mr. President,
yes,
we have a problem with you."
Right.
And I think the way politics have changed since then is so important to note in this case. Again, it's the context of this 40-year. So Nixon's out in 70.
The drift.
Right,
70,
the drift. He's out in 72. 73, yeah. Somewhere in there. Yeah, and then Ford.
Right, pardons him.
And then Jimmy Carter, and then Ronald Reagan.
Right.
And so you sort of have this 40-year thing in the U.S.
Gradual increasing culture war.
Right, and the temperature just kept getting turned up, and I mean, we could spend several shows on this. I mean, in a lot of ways, it goes back to
we will
the Civil, right, but the Civil War. I mean, it could go back to the failure of Reconstruction. It could go back to all that stuff, the failure of the Civil Rights Movement to really finally move us past the race question in America, and all that. All this stuff has been around and is embedded in our DNA, So the drift's not a surprise.
The
it's
Nixon
just,
Southern strategy.
Right.
I mean, I think that, and this is in a way, I think, more concerning. This may be of all the things we've talked about today, including the fact that I have potentially 6 months in jail hanging over my head. The thing that bothers me the most is that I don't really know whether Republicans in Congress are willing enough to stand up to this president to really put a restraint on him or remove him from office if necessary.
Where does the spin end?
That bothers me.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Because they're so tied up in the spin.
They're
Everyone's
so
spinning this,
They're so hyper-partisan.
No one is
and
I wasn't around for the Nixon administration, obviously, but I'm willing to bet that the partisanship wasn't quite what it is now. I can't imagine. I mean, it's so bad now. I mean, people are so Team R or Team D or Team Red or Team Blue. Like they will justify anything to defend Team Red or Team Blue.
There were moments. There was of course the committee, the Senate Special Investigating Committee on Watergate, that was chaired by Sam Ervin, but the ranking member was Tom Baker.
I think that's right.
Yeah,
now
but
I'm going to Google that.
Yeah. Let me know if I've got. I don't remember if I have his first name right, but I remember his last name was Baker. He was a senator from Tennessee. Later on, became chief of staff for somebody. But he was a nonpartisan guy. He was an old-fashioned, moderate Republican. And he was concerned about whether or not Watergate represented a constitutional crisis. Mm-hmm. And so he was one of those people who went to the president and said, "We have a problem." And when it came down to it, he was one of the people who was, willing to move forward with impeachment, which is what pushed Nixon out of office finally.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you think that this is kind of a political procedural question? Do you
about
think
Howard Baker?
Howard Baker. I'm sorry.
Okay, there we go.
Sorry.
So, do you think that having this firing Comey thing hanging over his head, do you think this is going to have a big impact on his overall agenda? It's going to slow things down because it seems like Trump's approval rating, I think, is 39%, 38%.
36.
Okay,
this week.
Wow.
The trajectory is bad. It looks like it's continuing to go down. So what little political capital he has, he looks like he's spending defending this decision. So what's going to happen when it comes down to
that's an interesting
the
point,
healthcare thing in the Senate? I mean,
this is part of what I mean when I say that the Republicans are defending him is that somebody like Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell, they're defending Trump, or they're moving ahead with their agenda because they want to get some things done, and they don't really, they're not letting this get in the way. So, for example, Paul Ryan didn't.
So they're moving forward.
Paul Ryan did an interview the other day where he said he's still interested in privatizing Medicare, believe it or not.
Okay.
Which is a pretty astonishing thing.
It is a pretty astonishing
Paul
thing.
Ryan,
they look at their Paul Ryan.
Okay.
But they look at their once in a lifetime opportunity of having the House, the Senate, and the White House in Republican hands, and they say, we're not going to let this go. Now, are they going to be able to do that? That's a good question, because one thing that has gotten in the way, for example, of their health care proposal is public opposition,
public outrage,
which brings us back to the issue of demonstrators showing up at town hall meetings and making the Republicans uncomfortable about talking to the press.
Which is something everyone who's listening should remember. This Trump-Comey thing, big story. It deserves your time, but they're still doing stuff. They're still trying to take healthcare away. They're still trying to cut $880 billion from Medicaid. I mean, they're still trying to do this stuff is still happening. Right. So don't spend 24 hours a day focusing on this Comey thing. It may mean something, but they're still doing stuff. They're still in control. And we got to chew gum and walk at the same time here as citizens.
The line that I've been using is that Trump is like the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. He's tyranny moderated by incompetence, right? And the fact that they really don't know what they're doing is getting in the way of what Trump wants to do. I mean, he still hasn't even really staffed his administration.
Right.
But Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell are not incompetent.
Right.
They know exactly
what they're doing, right? They've been trying to do this the whole time under Obama.
For a long time.
Right.
Well, and I think you bring up a really interesting point, because at what point does the good of the country come over this grab for power? And where is the tipping point? Yeah. I mean, when I say grab for power, let me make sure I'm disclaiming that. But the idea that you've got the executive branch and the legislative branch completely in Republican hands right now.
Right.
Really, it's sort of like President Obama, and I remember this, the last few presidents have gone through this, where they have a supermajority like this. So President Obama had this too when he first started. And look how hard he struggled to get the health care law passed.
Right.
Look how long and
look
hard.
how watered down it ended up when it did get passed.
Exactly. So there's a lot of precedent that shows that having those majorities is not always successful.
Yes.
And I think the question with the current GOP situation is, you're right. You have one branch that is very incompetent.
Right.
Juxtaposed with these, McConnell. Wiley McConnell. I mean, he's been around forever in Kentucky.
Yeah. Right.
And
Turtles live a very long time.
Yeah. He knows how to get things done. And
I know how to get it.
But what's it going to take is my question, for him to recognize this, or will he ever?
I don't know.
Well, I'm going into opinion mode here, but when your agenda and your power is more important than the good of the country, your question is, when does the good of the country matter more? It will never matter more for people whose agenda and their goals, their legislative goals, are more important. This is their opportunity.
They see this as the good of it. They see their agenda as the good of the country.
That's what they think.
That's what they think.
That's their opinion.
I think
I'll give them that.
To back up to talk about healthcare for a moment, and the comparison with Obama is apt. Because I don't know that healthcare bill, the healthcare proposal, or privatizing Medicare, or any number of things, the big tax proposal that they want to get through, is never going to be an easy lift.
No.
I mean, none of this stuff is going to be easy. If I had to speculate, I think that they might get. Well, I'm not going to speculate. I mean, there's some thoughts, but it's always going to be hard to get health care through the Senate. It's always going to be hard to get the tax reform done, period. And that's the way it should be. I mean, this is the way government works. The reason
this is democracy.
This is democracy.
It's supposed to be hard.
And this is why, Barack Obama was not incompetent. And he was very competent, and it was hard for him to do it. And there's a reason why that is.
And he had Ted Kennedy.
And he had Ted Kennedy.
He had lots of people helping him at that time. And
that's right. Really and it was still really hard to do. But that's built into the system. I think that the systemic breaks the balance of powers, the slowness of the process, the legislative process. This is to our benefit at this point. We'll see how well that holds up. I mean, I do think that finally, when they get down to it, the thing that the Republicans probably want most is a big tax cut for the rich. But politically, they're probably under the most pressure to have something that they can call a repeal of Obamacare.
Right. Just so they can say they did it. Because the House did it, 50 times under Obama, and now they've managed to pass it once.
Let me ask you a question, though. I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Is that real political pressure or perceived political pressure? Because I think that most West Virginians that I've talked to, and I went to a town hall with Manchin about a month ago, and talked to a lot of coal miners who are probably socially more conservative than many of the protesters who were there, or people from social action groups, for example,
more conservative.
And they were really upset about losing their health care. And now some of that's tied up in the miners' pensions and the miner packages that are tied up in coal companies, and that's a different thing to a degree. But I think it's really interesting. It's one thing to talk about repeal Obamacare, and then it's another thing to take people's health care away.
A lot of
one is a talking point, and the other is actual
reality.
Consequences.
Right.
A lot of Trump's voters have a lot to lose. Well, I do think that there was a commentator. My favorite commentator may have been Josh Marshall, who said this, that they stand to lose a lot if they try to do something unpopular, and maybe even more if they try to do something unpopular and fail, because then they're both wrong-headed and ineffective. So, I mean, they lose either way, but they may, in fact, lose more if they don't succeed in doing something.
That makes sense to me.
And also they erode their own base, which are the people who are dyed in the wool believing that 36%.
Especially in the House, where all the districts are created in a way where it's just people who are hardcore supporters of me and want this very specific thing done. I mean, the House definitely feels pressure. Now, the Senate, you may be a little more in that perceived pressure area.
Right.
But it's been interesting that the one substantive thing that this Congress has done so far has been a budget. I forget what they call it. It was one of these budget continuing resolutions or something. But it was very democratic.
Yeah, it boosted NEA. Boosted the NEA by a couple $1 million. Yeah,
no
I remember
money
that.
for the border wall.
Yeah.
And what this basically said to me was that Congress was just dismissing the president's wishes. They just sort of, it's like they're ignoring him.
Because ultimately, as you said, and as you pointed out, both John and Dan, you've both pointed this out, that ultimately their goal is that tax cut for the rich, and repeal of Obamacare. So all this other stuff. And I think when I think about what is the Achilles heel of the current situation for the GOP, and I see two. One is the hubris of Trump and his administration, sort of the arrogance and sort of this belief that they can do whatever they want. And the shock.
Trump's personality.
And they keep, exactly. They keep getting shocked by, oh no, democracy doesn't work like being a CEO of a company. You don't just get to hire and fire people and say what happens. You know? I think that is in that incompetence that you've alluded to is part of the problem, part of their challenge. And I think maybe the other Achilles heel is that in the end, eventually one day, everyone's going to recognize, including, I hate to even use this term, the white working class,
she's using quotey fingers. By the way.
I am. Yeah,
quotes.
They're all going to wait. Everyone's going to realize that it's just been a smokescreen this whole time, and I would argue they already know that because they went for Bernie Sanders in such great numbers.
Yep. Well, Bernie Sanders came to was it McDowell County?
Yep.
And got everybody to cheer for Medicare for all, universal health care.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's people are more nuanced than you think. So let's switch gears here. We have one more thing I want to talk about here.
Right.
And I'm not seeing a lot of people talk about this, so that's why I want to bring it up. There's a 2-3 decision in the West Virginia Supreme Court that now has ruled anti-gay violence not a hate crime.
That's pretty astonishing to me.
This started with a guy, Stuart Butler, is a college football player. He attacked two men after seeing them kiss.
Oh, this was in Marshall, the case in Huntington.
I'm not sure. They didn't mention.
Well, I think he's a Marshall. I think he's a Marshall football player, so
he started yelling slurs at them, and I guess he attacked them and was charged with battery and a hate crime. So this worked its way to the West Virginia Supreme Court, and I guess the statute does say it does include, quote, violence because of sex, which to me is, I think I get that. I think that's clear enough for me, but apparently it wasn't for them, so they had to debate it, and it came out to a 2-3 decision favoring that it does not explicitly bar violence against people for their orientation. So now the statute
do you have who the different
Who were the? I was
No,
looking at
I
how the
don't.
court broke
I don't,
down.
but I'm sure that's
would be
available.
interesting.
I'll look that up while you guys
that'd be
keep
good to
going.
know.
Because,
But,
I mean,
what's your take on that, Dan?
Well, interesting. I mean, it's a very
Kind of a bizarre thing to happen.
well. It's a pretty restricted. I mean, I could see the logic of it. Sometimes these issues.
I think when you
of
think
law,
about something too much, you end up getting in way. Like, this is one of those things where I think they got way too far. They thought about it way too hard. This is an easy A. And they screwed it up.
Well, one of the things that happens in legal cases sometimes is that it comes down to the definition of words, right? So the definition of sex, does that include gender preference or sexual preference, or is it just
somebody's
strictly
gender
biological? Yeah, and so we have a kind of a
right.
cultural divide there, because a cultural conservative is going to say that your gender is the kind of genitalia you were born with,
Right.
which I can understand that argument. I don't necessarily agree with it, although it does kind of, I can see why they would say that.
Well,
I think that, part of what we're seeing here is the result of the failure of the legislature to address this, because I think there have been a number of attempts to really change that law to include, specifically to include sexual preference, in it, in terms of, you can't also discrimination. Sexual preference. You can't discriminate on basis of sexual preference. But I think there's also been attempts to change the hate crimes law in that regard.
On the federal level?
I think at the state level. I think that's happened at the West Virginia legislature. And the West Virginia legislature, being very conservative right now, and culturally very conservative, has been unwilling to do that.
Do you see this maybe changing in the future, something like this? Because to me it seems...
I sure hope so.
No one's really talking about it right now because of what's going on. There's so many other things going on.
Yeah,
And,
I was sort of surprised when you told me that this had happened.
Right. Yeah, I was too.
I mean, this is something that, in a way, like, people have been asking me about my arrest, and at one point I said, look, what I'm interested in here is what happens to the health care of battered women. Their situation is important. My situation is not important. Similarly,
It's important to you.
Yeah, well, yeah, but I'm me.
Right, I got you.
The situation of somebody who gets beat up because they're homosexual, that's a big frickin' deal.
Yeah.
That is crucial to them. And should be crucial to us. But it is one of those things that kind of, as it were, hides in the shadows. I don't want to, that's maybe a bad metaphor, but it isn't something that gets a lot of attention to it.
Laura, what's your take on that?
First of all, I think that it's just sad
Right.
and morally wrong for someone to
Morally
be beaten.
reprehensible.
Yeah, someone to be beaten because of sexual preference. I think what I was thinking when you guys were talking about this, though, is that in many ways, I really believe that society has moved on.
Society's way on.
I think most
so.
West Virginians even. My last place of employment was with the United Methodist Church, where I served as director of communications. Mm-hmm. And the United Methodist Church is in a huge, huge battle over LGBTQI rights right now.
Right.
And I saw this play out over and over again in the church, where the church really cares about this. Some people in the church do. But what we've learned over time, what I learned during my tenure there, was the number of complaints that I got about that issue compared to the number of complaints I got about other things was so small. The vast majority of West Virginians, whether they're Methodist or not, I just don't think they get up in the morning and think about this. I think most of them don't care. The society has moved on.
In a way,
I think you have a vocal minority.
Americans and West Virginians are actually very libertarian. They don't care.
If you stay out of my business, I'll stay out of yours. I mean, having said that,
But wanting to protect a certain type of person with hate crime laws is different from saying, well, you mind your business and I'll mind my own. That's a general philosophy.
No, I agree with that.
This is a thing I think you'll find more resistance to.
Right. Well, I agree with that, but I don't think most West Virginians, and maybe I'm wrong, But I really don't believe the vast majority of West Virginians, people I've met all over the country, think people should be beaten because they're gay or lesbian or transgender. I think I think most of us would find that reprehensible because
because it is
right. It's not
did you look up?
I did. I looked up the Supreme Court decision.
Okay, let's read those names.
Okay, let me make sure I got it right now. So Lowry, Ketchum, and Walker voted for, and I believe it was Davis and Workman who dissented.
Really?
And maybe I got it. I'm trying to figure that out. Let me make absolutely sure I'm right.
Lowry, Ketchum,
Lowry and Ketchum definitely. Let me read.
Voted against the expansion of including homosexuals in the protections of hate crimes.
Yeah, Slate had a really good article about it.
It's out there.
Yeah,
I mean, there are people talking about this. It's just not, the air's just getting sucked out of the room with this Comey thing. And honestly, with your arrest is a bigger story, really, which, like you said, I mean, it's a big story to us.
Yeah.
But this is I feel like this should be a much bigger story
than it is. I think it's a bigger story than it's been getting, because I missed it. I didn't see it.
All right. So we are getting ready to wrap up here. So what we need to do, we need to go into a segment, the Donald Trump tweet of the week, a.k.a. Tiny Fingered Bully Report. Let's talk about that here for a minute here. As a very active president with lots of things happening, it is not possible for my surrogates to stand at podium with perfect accuracy, ! And then ... At podium, not at a podium, just at podium, which I don't know. The more you say it, the more it kind of sounds okay, but I don't think it is. Then ! I
love that ! That's quite a Twitter kind of thing.
He's such a Twitter guy.
He really is.
So what he's saying is, why are you expecting my surrogates to be accurate?
Well, this is a response to the fact that they can't get their stuff together.
I got the vote. Sorry.
I'm so obsessed
go ahead.
with that.
I know the Donald Trump tweet of the week, important stuff. Although he had so many. He had so many.
Yes,
he had so many.
There were several this week. It was hard to choose this week.
Oh yeah, that would have been a tough one. It was Lowry, Ketchum, and Walker.
Right.
Who voted that way.
Yeah.
Dissenting opinion: Workman and Robin Davis.
Right. You know what's interesting about that?
I don't know, but we got 10 seconds.
Walker is a very conservative woman, but the other two, the two that voted against, were sort of moderate, liberal women.
Yeah, they voted for.
There's a gender.
They
voted
dissenting.
They were the ones who dissented in favor
of
added protections for homosexuals.
So everyone look into that. Everyone needs to pay attention to that. I want people to look into that particular story. West Virginia Supreme Court ruled that anti-gay violence is not a hate crime. So there you go.
Thanks, Laura.
All right.
Thanks,
so I want to thank Dan for coming on the show. I'm glad you're okay.
Yeah, and, we may have to arrange to have a separate host in for 60 to 90 days, depending on what happens.
Well, we'll see. I mean, we'll see. We'll keep you all updated on the show.
I do from jail.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Well, you're getting. You got to get a network started.
There's already a podcast on that. I'll talk.
Okay. So also, I want to thank Lauren for coming on.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Make sure to follow us on Twitter at Mountain State Up, and also. Catch up on old episodes, including this one, on our YouTube channel. I've been archiving them all on there for you to watch and catch up on. I'm John Cantis. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week, Sunday at noon, WTSQ 88.1 LP.
Charleston, West Virginia.
You
got it.
All right.